They thought it would stay hidden behind velvet curtains and gilded doors. Yet the whispers grew louder, echoing through the palace corridors, maids, footmen, butlers, all murmuring the same name, Camila. Something had happened, something unspeakable, and the silence that followed was not ordinary discipline. It was a rebellion, uncoiling in secret against the queen consort herself. What began as faint murmurs became a steady rhythm of defiance, almost invisible to outsiders, but unmistakable to those within the palace. An attendant who once rushed forward with a tray of wine now lingered deliberately, forcing Camila to reach for what was no longer offered with grace. A butler, known for his flawless punctuality, hesitated at her summons, his silence louder than any refusal, and the subtle gestures grew into an unspoken pact. The palace had always been a fortress of order, every movement polished, every detail rehearsed to perfection. Staff were trained to serve without hesitation, to ensure that no shadow of discontent was ever glimpsed beyond the walls. Yet suddenly, cracks appeared in this performance. A door that once opened instantly seemed to resist her hand. Trays that should have arrived at her fingertips disappeared from sight. Even her calls for assistance seemed to echo unanswered, swallowed by silence. For Camila, these moments could be dismissed as accidents, perhaps coincidence. But for those who watched closely, there was no doubt. This was no clumsy error, it was deliberate defiance. The loyalty of the household was no longer anchored to the crown she wore. It had shifted, silently and powerfully, toward another. For years, Catherine had built bonds with the very people who moved unseen in the palace halls. She had remembered their names when others did not. She had thanked them for service long after the cameras left. When an assistant was seen weary after a long day, she noticed. When a maid fell ill, she sent comfort, not orders. When a maid fell being, footman's child was hospitalized, it was Catherine who sent flowers and a handwritten note. These were small gestures, but in a palace where hierarchy often stripped away humanity, such moments lingered like rare treasures. To the staff, Catherine was not just a future queen. She was the heart of the monarchy itself. Camila, however, was remembered for something far different. Sharp remarks, cold dismissals, a tone that left servants feeling less like people and more like tools. Where Catherine softened burdens with kindness, Camila heightened them with criticism. Where Catherine lifted spirits, Camila crushed them under her indifference. And so, when Camila crossed the invisible boundary, when she did something that visibly wounded Catherine, the staff made their decision. Their rebellion would not be loud or dramatic. It would be subtle, but it would cut deeper than any words. They would withdraw not their presence, but their devotion. And in a palace built on service, that absence spoke louder than defiance ever could. It was not the kind of revolt that history books capture with banners and marches. It was a rebellion of footsteps fading away as Camila approached. A rebellion of hands that remained still instead of reaching forward. A rebellion of eyes that no longer looked to her as their queen. Each gesture, each withheld act of service, was a declaration. Their loyalty belonged to Catherine, and no one else. The whispers carried a single refrain, repeated in hushed tones between corridors and kitchens. She crossed it, the line you do not cross. No one needed to explain what that meant, because everyone already knew. It was Catherine. It was what Camila had done to her, and it was unforgivable. But to understand why the palace's most loyal servants risked everything, we must revisit the night when Camila struck a blow so cruel it left Catherine humiliated before the monarchy itself. Behind the closed doors of a grand dining hall, a quiet evening meant to symbolize unity became the battlefield for humiliation. Guests watched in horror as a royal dinner transformed into a war of whispered insults, and in the middle stood Catherine, blindsided by Camilla's merciless strike. What should have been a gathering of reconciliation, a moment to remind both family and dignitaries of strength, turned instead into an exhibition of cruelty. Camila, sharp-eyed and coldly calculating, chose her moment with precision. It began subtly with an offhand comment here, a biting remark there, each aimed to chip away at Catherine's dignity while cloaked in the illusion of jest. But beneath the laughter, those words cut like blades, and Catherine, unprepared for such malice, found herself cornered before an audience that could see every wound. The evening grew heavier as the tension thickened in the air. Guests shifted uneasily in their seats, sensing a battle unfolding that no one dared interrupt. Camilla's remarks grew bolder, each one carrying an unmistakable edge meant not only to embarrass but to assert dominance. There was no accidental slip of the tongue. It was deliberate. Each word reminded Catherine of her place not by blood, but by marriage. A position Camila dismissed as fragile, temporary, and undeserving of reverence. And then came the cruelest strike of all, a remark that froze the room into silence. Catherine's role, Camila declared with chilling disdain, was borrowed, not earned. She was temporary, not bloodline. The words, venomous in their simplicity, echoed across the table, with a finality that left the entire gathering stunned. For Catherine, whose grace had carried her through countless public trials, this was a rare moment of visible breaking. Her composure faltered. Her face, pale beneath the glow of chandeliers, betrayed the pain she tried desperately to conceal. For the first time, the mask of royal strength slipped, and those present witnessed a woman wounded not by accident, but by intent. She excused herself quietly, but the weight of her silence carried more power than any outburst. With her head lowered, she retreated from the room, leaving behind an audience torn between loyalty, pity, and shock. To those who adored her, that sight, Catherine leaving with tears in her eyes, was both unthinkable and unforgettable. The staff, always alert but rarely involved in private disputes, could not ignore what they saw. The whispers began almost immediately. She made her cry. She crossed the line. For many attendants, the moment triggered haunting memories of Diana, who had endured similar cruelties under the same roof. The parallels were unmistakable. Another woman beloved by the public, cornered and diminished within palace walls. Camilla's words that night did not merely bruise Catherine. They reopened scars from a past the monarchy had sworn would never be repeated. In those hushed exchanges between footmen and maids, one truth began to take root. Camila had overstepped, and this time, forgiveness would not come easily. That dinner became a turning point, not just for Catherine, but for the entire household. Her humiliation was not confined to whispers within the palace. It lingered in the hearts of every servant who had long admired her kindness. For them, this was not a clash of personalities. It was a betrayal of the very dignity Catherine embodied. And though Camila believed she had asserted her authority, what she had truly done was light the first spark of a quiet rebellion. Yet what unfolded that night was only the beginning, because Camilla's cruelty would not remain hidden behind banquet doors. Soon, she would take her humiliation of Catherine onto the grandest of stages. The chandeliers sparkled, dignitaries applauded, and cameras rolled, yet what was meant to be a display of royal harmony quickly descended into a scene of betrayal. With the world watching, Camila delivered her most devastating blow to Catherine. The occasion had been carefully designed to project stability and elegance, a showcase of unity meant to silence whispers of internal tension. But beneath the polished smiles and rehearsed gestures, a storm was already gathering. Camila, emboldened by her private victory at the dinner table weeks before, chose this night to extend her cruelty beyond the shadows of palace walls. It began subtly, as it always did. A sharp undertone, disguised as wit, a carefully phrased comment that sliced deeper than anyone expected. Catherine, poised and graceful, stood alongside foreign dignitaries, unaware of the ambush about to unfold. And then came the words calculated, deliberate, impossible to mistake. In full view of international leaders, Camila diminished her. She mocked her role, alluding once again to its fragility, framing Catherine not as a partner in the monarchy's future, but as a mere figure who had wandered too close to power. The remark, though cloaked in ceremonial banter, was a dagger. It struck Catherine not only personally but symbolically, reducing her standing before those who mattered most. The silence that followed was suffocating. Conversations stilled, glasses hung in midair, and eyes darted nervously between the two women. Catherine froze. Her composure, usually unshakable under scrutiny, faltered in that instant. The weight of betrayal bore down upon her, her expression revealing shock, disbelief, and a grief she could not conceal. She did not lash out. She did not respond. Instead, she stood motionless, the embodiment of quiet devastation. And in that moment, the monarchy's veneer of harmony cracked before the watching world. The staff, scattered discreetly among the hall, moved quickly. They saw what others only sensed: the collapse of dignity in real time. Loyal attendants, horrified by what had just occurred, stepped closer to shield Catherine from further embarrassment, ushering her with a quiet urgency toward privacy. For them, this was not their duty. This was protection. They knew the cameras would capture none of this, for the palace would ensure it. But they had seen it, they had heard it, and they would never forget. The room itself seemed to collapse into unease. Diplomats whispered among themselves, uncertain whether to acknowledge the fracture or pretend nothing had happened. For an institution built upon the illusion of strength, this slip was catastrophic. Camilla's words had not only humiliated Catherine, they had unsettled the very foundation of the monarchy's image before foreign powers. To outsiders, it was an awkward silence. To insiders, it was the unraveling of a dynasty. And while the footage was quickly buried, carefully trimmed and polished by palace handlers to present an image of grace, the truth spread like wildfire among those who had been present. The whispers of rebellion that had begun in kitchens and corridors now carried an undeniable weight. Catherine's suffering was no longer whispered in private. It had been etched into the memory of dignitaries across the globe. Staff whispered among themselves, this was no accident, no passing slight. It was intentional, and it demanded a response. William, too, felt the sting of that night. Observers noticed his silence, his rigid stance beside his wife, and the fury in his eyes that he struggled to contain. Those closest to him later confessed that his anger was not just outrage, but something far more dangerous. A vow that the cruelty inflicted upon his wife would not be allowed to stand. Though he said nothing publicly, his restraint masked a storm gathering inside him, one that would not remain unspoken for long. If Camila thought the world would forget, she miscalculated in the palace halls. Catherine's humiliation had already sparked a dangerous rebellion. It began with silence, a bow withheld, a tray left untouched, a door that did not open. To the outside world, these were invisible details. But within the palace walls, they were daggers of defiance, proof that the staff had chosen their queen, and it was not Camila. At first, it appeared as if coincidence explained these slights. A servant, distracted, a moment's delay, a forgotten courtesy. But as days passed, the pattern became undeniable. The glances exchanged between attendants, the deliberate hesitations, the softened looks offered toward Catherine. They revealed a deeper truth. Service was no longer neutral. It had become a weapon, wielded in silence against the woman who had wounded their future queen. Letters began to appear, slipping quietly into Catherine's chambers when no one else could see. They carried words written in hurried, secretive hands. "We stand with you. You are not alone. We have not forgotten." For Catherine, who bore her pain quietly, these messages were more than comfort. They were proof that the rebellion had shifted from whispers to conviction. Behind every locked door, the staff repeated their pledge. Their loyalty was no longer bound to the crown Camila wore, but to the woman who had treated them as more than shadows. They remembered the warmth in her voice when she thanked them, the kindness of her handwritten notes, and the gentleness of her concern when tragedy struck their families. These were not gestures made for cameras, they were acts of humanity, and in a palace starved of warmth, they meant everything. In their eyes, Catherine had become something far greater than a princess. She was the embodiment of what Diana once represented, a figure of grace who carried the people's love and endured her struggles with dignity. The comparisons were whispered but ever present. Where Diana had been broken by cruelty, Catherine stood resilient, a woman determined not to collapse under the same weight. And to those who served in silence, Catherine was not simply following in Diana's footsteps, she was continuing the legacy that Camilla seemed determined to erase. Meanwhile, Camilla's reputation unraveled with every passing day. The sharpness in her tone, the cold detachment in her manner, only deepened the staff's resentment. Where Catherine's presence lifted spirits, Camilla's voice cast a shadow. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Every slight against Catherine magnified Camilla's flaws. Every moment of Catherine's dignity heightened the cruelty of Camilla's outbursts. And so, the staff no longer concealed their preference. It was written in their stillness, in their refusals, in the weight of service withheld. The rebellion was no longer passive, it was deliberate. Trays that once carried tea for Camilla arrived half-cold. Doors she expected to open remained heavy against her hand. Footsteps faded when she entered a room, leaving her surrounded by absence. These were not accidents, they were choices. Choices that spoke louder than words, louder than any banner of defiance could ever declare. The palace itself seemed to have chosen sides, its silence ringing with loyalty to Catherine and rejection of Camilla. But defiance has consequences, and when Camilla realized the staff were no longer hers to command, she unleashed a rage that shook the palace walls. For weeks, she told herself it was a coincidence, but when the defiance became undeniable, Camilla's mask slipped. Behind locked doors, her fury erupted, echoing through Buckingham Palace like thunder, and for the first time, her staff saw not a queen, but a woman unraveling. The cold precision she once wielded gave way to a rage that could not be concealed. She demanded explanations, shouted accusations, and hurled threats that sent even seasoned attendants retreating into silence. It was no longer about authority. It was desperation. She wanted obedience, demanded loyalty, but what she found was resistance, and that resistance only fueled her anger. Her tirades became infamous within the palace walls. Senior aides were summoned to draw up loyalty lists, their pens scratching names onto paper with trembling hands. Those suspected of disloyalty were marked. Any servant seen offering Catherine even the smallest gesture of comfort was accused of betrayal. Threats of dismissal rained down, but rather than instill fear, they hardened the staff's quiet rebellion. Camilla's words did not inspire respect, they revealed panic. For every threat she uttered, another servant whispered privately of her downfall, and the more she tried to tighten her grip, the more it slipped through her fingers. What Camilla failed to realize was that her fury could not be contained. Recordings, captured discreetly, began to circulate. Snippets of her voice cracking with rage, accusing those beneath her of treachery, were smuggled beyond palace gates. Within days, they reached the hands of journalists, eager to decode the mysteries behind Buckingham's walls. Headlines blazed with brutal clarity. Royal meltdown. Camilla's rage. The queen consort's fury, meant to terrify her household into obedience, became the very weapon that exposed her to the world. Each headline stripped away the carefully maintained image of control, leaving behind the portrait of a woman consumed by bitterness. And yet, through all of this, King Charles remained silent. Those closest to him whispered that he was torn, trapped between protecting the woman he had fought to legitimize and safeguarding the institution he had sworn to uphold. His silence, however, was read not as neutrality, but as weakness. To the staff, it was abandonment. To the public, it was complicated. His unwillingness to intervene allowed Camilla's rage to grow unchecked, shaking the very foundation of the monarchy he was meant to steady. The crown, which should have symbolized strength, now appeared fragile under the weight of his indecision. But if Camilla's fury weakened the monarchy, it elevated Catherine. For while Camilla raged, Catherine remained composed, silent, and dignified. The contrast could not have been sharper. Each scream from Camilla made Catherine's calm more powerful. Every act of cruelty made Catherine's quiet grace shine brighter. To the staff, to the public, and to those within the palace who dared compare, the choice was obvious. One woman ruled with anger, the other with humanity. One demanded loyalty, the other inspired it. And so the rebellion deepened. Camilla's attempts to crush Defiance only gave it fuel. The palace walls reverberated with her fury, but within the silence of its servants, a far greater strength was building. They no longer feared her voice, they pitied it, and in that pity was the most dangerous truth of all, that her authority was crumbling before their very eyes. But silence could no longer protect Catherine, for William had reached his breaking point, and his fury would soon erupt into confrontation. The palace walls had heard countless arguments, but none like this. When William stormed into Camilla's chambers, his fury was unrestrained. For Catherine, for the staff, and for the memory of his mother, he demanded answers. And this time, there would be no retreat. For weeks, he had remained silent, swallowing his rage, while his wife endured humiliation and the servants bore the brunt of Camilla's retaliation. But now, the silence shattered. His voice rang through the halls with a force that made even the most seasoned aides pause in fear. This was no ordinary dispute. This was a confrontation that carried the weight of history. William demanded to know why. Why Catherine had been humiliated. Why were the staff punished for their loyalty? Why cruelty had replaced dignity within the palace? Camila, startled but defiant, attempted to mask her actions behind the language of tradition. She insisted that order had to be preserved, that Catherine was becoming too visible, too influential, and that boundaries needed to be enforced. But her excuses fell flat against William's rage. He saw not tradition, but deliberate cruelty dressed in protocol. He pressed harder, refusing to let her hide behind formality. His words cut through her defenses, exposing the truth she could not disguise. Her jealousy, her fear of being overshadowed, her desperate attempt to claim power at Catherine's expense. The confrontation grew louder, more vicious with every passing second. Witnesses later described it as the most explosive clash in decades, a storm of voices that shook the palace itself. And then came the moment that silenced even Camilla's sharp tongue. William invoked the one name she could not deflect: Diana. His words trembled with restrained fury as he told her, "Do not make Catherine suffer the same fate." In that single sentence, he unleashed the full weight of a wound that had never healed. He reminded her that he had already watched one woman he loved destroyed by cruelty within those walls, and he would not allow history to repeat itself. The memory of Diana hung in the air like a ghost, and for a moment, even Camilla faltered. But William did not stop there. His anger only deepened, fueled by years of silence, and by the sight of his wife being torn down in the very place meant to protect her. He condemned her treatment of the staff, her attempts to control through fear, her reckless outbursts that had leaked into the press and brought disgrace upon the monarchy. His words were unyielding, each one hammering home the reality she could no longer escape, that her actions had not strengthened the crown, but weakened it beyond repair. And then came his vow, spoken with chilling clarity. No one humiliates Catherine without consequences, not even you. It was not an empty threat. It was a declaration that the future king had chosen his side, and that side was his wife. The air in the chamber grew heavy with the aftermath of his words. Camilla tried to recover her composure, to argue, to defend herself. But nothing she said could erase the line he had, drawn in fire. For the first time, she was confronted not as the queen consort, but as the source of a fracture that threatened the monarchy itself. And though the shouting eventually subsided, the echoes lingered, whispering through the corridors long after the confrontation ended. Those who heard it knew something fundamental had changed. William had broken the silence, and the storm could no longer be contained. Yet while William's words drew a line in fire, the battle was far from over, because what came next would not be fought in whispers, but across the nation's headlines. For centuries, the monarchy had weathered scandal, but never had it faced whispers of open mutiny. What began as silence in the corridors now blazed across international headlines, forcing the world to ask if the crown itself was collapsing from within. The rebellion that had started with withheld bows and vanished trays could no longer be contained. Stories slipped from palace walls and found their way into newspapers and broadcasts across the globe. The words printed in bold ink carried a chilling weight: palace mutiny, servants in revolt, the crown in crisis. What was once whispered in kitchens and corridors now became a spectacle for the entire world. And the monarchy, long accustomed to controlling the narrative, was powerless to stop it. Foreign media seized the story with ruthless efficiency. British outlets speculated cautiously. But international networks went further, painting vivid images of a crumbling monarchy eaten from within by dissent. Commentators spoke of dysfunction, of a queen consort rejected by her own household, and of a princess whose quiet dignity was now the only anchor holding the crown together. Diplomats, unsettled by the rumors, began to withdraw. Invitations were cancelled. State visits were postponed. Allies who once relied on the monarchy as a symbol of stability now whispered privately about its unraveling. For Britain, the image of authority projected for centuries faltered, and the world was watching every crack form in real time. The crisis deepened further as King Charles's health became impossible to ignore. His visible frailty, once managed discreetly, now fed speculation that the monarchy lacked not only unity but leadership. Was the crown, already destabilized by internal rebellion, now leaderless? His silence during the storm spoke volumes, and each appearance, marked by weariness, fueled rumors that he was too weak to steady the throne in its darkest hour. The timing could not have been worse. A fractured household, a consort under siege, and a king whose presence no longer reassured but worried together painted the image of a monarchy at its most fragile point in generations. For Camila, the collapse was swift and merciless. Once able to navigate scandal with careful spin, she now faced a wave of outrage too vast to contain. The leaked recordings of her fury, the accounts of her cruelty toward Catherine, and the stories of staff rebellion stripped away any illusion of control. Tabloids that once softened her image now tore it apart, describing her as desperate, paranoid, and unfit to command the respect she demanded. In contrast, Catherine's silence became her greatest strength. While Camilla raged, Catherine remained composed, her refusal to engage with scandal only elevating her stature. She became the figure of resilience the monarchy so desperately needed, a woman wronged yet unbroken, embodying both the memory of Diana and the hope for a future monarchy defined by grace rather than fear. The divide could no longer be hidden. One woman clung to power with fury and desperation, the other embodied strength by saying nothing at all. The staff, the public, and the watching world began to make their choice. The crown still rested on Charles's head, but in the court of global opinion, the monarchy had already begun to shift its loyalty. Camilla's authority weakened with every headline, while Catherine's symbolic power grew stronger with every moment of dignified silence. But just as the crisis seemed unbearable, another revelation emerged, one that would tip the scales permanently against Camilla. Buried in the archives, a handwritten note surfaced, a note never meant for public eyes, one that revealed Catherine's deepest pain. Its words were not polished statements but raw confessions, and once read, they became the spark that ignited a movement. For years, Catherine had carried herself with grace, masking her struggles behind composure. But the note, scribbled in her own hand, unveiled the truth of a woman who had endured more than the world could ever see. It was a window into her silent suffering, a voice that spoke of isolation, humiliation, and the heavy burden of living beneath a crown that often felt more like a cage. The note was not dramatic in length, but devastating in content. In it, Catherine pleaded for the simplest things: dignity, respect, and peace. Not titles, not power, not glory. Just the humanity she had been so often denied within the palace walls. That quiet plea cut through the heart of every person who read it, for it spoke not as a royal addressing a kingdom, but as a woman begging to be treated with decency in her own home. It was the kind of vulnerability that shattered the carefully constructed illusion of harmony, exposing the wounds that had been inflicted in silence. When the staff stumbled upon the note, their reaction was immediate and emotional. Hardened attendants who had served through decades of scandal were seen in tears, clutching the paper as if it were both proof and prophecy. They recognized in her words the same despair that once haunted Diana's letters. The parallels were impossible to ignore. Another beloved woman, adored by the public, quietly crying for help behind palace gates. To the staff, the note was not merely Catherine's pain, it was history repeating itself, a cruel cycle threatening to consume yet another princess. In their hearts, the vow was made this time they would not stand by in silence. When William read the note, the atmosphere changed entirely. Those present described the scene as one of raw intensity. His jaw tightened, his eyes darkened, and his silence carried more weight than any outburst. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, but filled with fury. History would not be repeated. What had been allowed to happen to Diana would never be allowed to happen to Catherine. It was more than a promise. It was a declaration of war against the forces that sought to break her spirit. His vow was the turning point that transformed private rebellion into an unshakable movement. But the note did not remain locked away. Somehow it slipped beyond the inner circle, whispered first among sympathetic staff, and then carried into the hands of the press. When its words emerged, carefully quoted in headlines, the world was shaken. Public sympathy for Catherine erupted with a force that stunned even the palace. People across the nation, and indeed the globe, rallied around her pain. Hashtags, editorials, and broadcasts all echoed her words. Dignity, respect, peace. The monarchy, already fractured, now found itself facing a storm of outrage it could not silence. For the staff, the note was more than evidence. It was a rallying cry. No longer was there rebellion whispered in the shadows. It became united, fierce, and unbreakable. Catherine had asked for protection in ink, but what she received was something even greater. A movement, ready to defend her dignity at any cost. The corridors that once carried only silence now pulsed with unspoken unity, the servants standing shoulder to shoulder in defiance of a queen consort they no longer recognized. The stage was set for the final act, the moment when the rebellion would no longer be whispered in shadows, but displayed before the world. The palace had planned a glittering evening of unity. But when the queen consort called for assistance, and no one moved, history was made. Before foreign eyes, Camila was left utterly alone, a queen without loyalty, abandoned by those sworn to serve. The silence was deafening, broken only by the soft gasps that rippled through the hall as dignitaries realized they were witnessing a collapse in real time. Every second stretched, every glance revealed the truth. The crown no longer commanded devotion. Then, as if orchestrated by fate, William and Catherine entered. Calm, composed, unshaken, they carried a presence that drew the room's attention instantly. Where Camila stood deserted, Catherine radiated quiet authority, the staff instinctively gravitating toward her. Bows lowered, heads turned, and the hall itself seemed to shift its allegiance. Dignitaries followed suit, offering their respect not to the consort in distress, but to the princess who had suffered in silence and emerged unbroken. In that single moment, Camila understood. Titles, jewels, and crowns meant nothing without loyalty. And loyalty was something she had lost forever. The monarchy had chosen Catherine, and Camila would never recover from what she did. And so, the rebellion ended not with banners or blood, but with silence. The silence of servants who had chosen their queen, and a monarchy forever reshaped. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.